Let's get started on Chapter 12, Network Management and Administration. We have 5 objectives in this chapter: creating and managing user and group accounts, creating and managing NTFS permissions, sharing files and printers, monitoring system performance, and identifying fault-tolerant and backup solutions. So let's start out with creating and managing user and group accounts. What is a domain? A domain is an organization, and an organization could include 10 people, it could include 10,000 people. A domain is composed of users and computers. CCBC is a domain. A domain controller is also called a login server. What makes it a domain controller is the fact that it has Active Directory on it. And Active Directory is a database of usernames and passwords. And the purpose of Active Directory is authentication. So when we are creating new users, we are creating new users in Active Directory. This is called Active Directory Management. So let's just review: creating a user, deleting a user, and resetting a password. If a new employee is hired at the company, we create a new user. We go into Active Directory, we right-click on users, we select new, we select user, and then we type in the user's first name, such as Bob, and his last name, such as White, and his login name, which is typically the first letter of the first name followed by the last name. Then we click on Next. We assign the user a password and we confirm the password, and then we have 4 variables which we can configure here. User must change password at next logon. User cannot change password at next logon. Password never expires, and account is disabled. I'm certainly not going to click on account is disabled. Account is disabled might be used if you are creating the employee right now, but they don't really start working for another month. If it's disabled, the account is there, but the user can't log in. The only checkbox I'm going to check off is user must change password at next login. I click on Next, I click on Finish, and now I have created a new user called Bob White, and now Bob can log on. If Bob forgets his password, I can right-click on his user account, and I can select Reset Password, and I can give Bob a new password. And when Bob leaves the company, then it's my obligation to delete the user account. These are basic user account management: creating users, deleting users, and resetting passwords. Now, let's look at user account properties, such as login name, account locked, account disabled, and account expired, time restrictions, home folder, profile, and group membership. If I go into Active Directory and I go to my user Bob and I right-click and select Properties, under the General tab I can say there's his username and there is his email address. But what we are really concerned with is the Account tab. The Account tab shows us the user's name, which is B. White, and the domain which he is a member of. If we look at login hours, we can see that we can restrict Bob such that he can only log in from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Monday through Friday. Furthermore, we have a checkbox here that says Unlock Account. Now, the account would get locked if a bad guy were trying to break in and he was guessing passwords, and he guessed passwords so many times it would lock the account. To review from the security chapter, we configured group policy, the account lockout. We configured it such that if the user gets the password wrong a certain number of times in a certain period of time, then it will lock the user account. And this is to protect the system from a bad guy who's just guessing passwords and guessing passwords and guessing passwords. So if the bad guy gets the password wrong enough times, that is going to lock the account, and then this checkbox would be checked. And we as administrators cannot check this checkbox. It can only get checked if somebody gets the password wrong too many times. We can't check it. We can only clear this checkbox, and then that will allow the user to log in again. And then we've looked at these other properties when we created the user account. User must change password at next login. User cannot change password. Password never expires. And then another variable is account is disabled. Now, account is disabled would be used if you didn't want the user to be able to log in. You don't want to delete the user account, but you don't want the user to be able to log in. Maybe they're on extended leave of absence. This is account disabled. And then don't confuse that with account expires. If you are hiring somebody for only 90 days, when you create the user account, you would specify that the account expires in 90 days. And then after 90 days, they can no longer log in. That way you don't have to remember to disable the user account when they cease to be an employee. Now, if their contract gets extended for another 90 days, then you can expand this account expiration date. So it's easy to confuse account lockout with account disabled with account expires. Account lockout happens when a bad guy is guessing passwords and it locks the account. Account disabled is something that we can do as administrators if we don't want the person to be able to log in. And account expired is used when somebody is only hired for a temporary contract. Now, let's look at the Profile tab. The Profile tab shows the profile and the home folder. So let's talk about home folder. By default, the home folder is on the local computer. So if a user simply saves a file, it goes to the hard disk of the local computer where the user is currently logged onto. And if the user logs onto the same computer every single day, that's not a problem. But if the user saves the file on one computer one day, and then the next day logs into another computer and tries to open the file up, the user is going to say, hey, where are my files? So what we do is we configure the home folder not to be on the local computer, but to be saved up to the server. And that way, regardless of the workstation that the user logs onto, the files will always be saved up to the server, and the user can get to those files. So what we do is we go to Bob's account properties, and under home folder, the radio button for local path is selected. We select the lower radio button that says connect to. And now Bob's Z drive will be mapped to server 1 to the user's folder, to the folder that corresponds to Bob's login name. And that way Bob's home folder will be up on the server instead of on the individual workstation. That way Bob saves files up to the server. On the server, there's a folder called Bob, which is under the folder called Users, which is under the root of the C drive. That's called the home folder. So then, if a user saves a file to the home folder, when the user goes to another computer the next day, the file is still available. This is called saving the home folder up on the server instead of the local workstation. Now, let's talk about what's meant by profile. A profile is a file which saves user environmental variables such as screen color or desktop icons or default printer or other variables as well. If you, for example, add extra icons to your desktop, then those icons will be saved in the profile. So if you log off and you log back on, those icons will still be there. Every time you log on, the computer reads from the profile. If you change the screen colors, those changes will be saved in the profile. So if you log off and you log back on, the screen colors will still be available, because whenever you log on, the operating system reads from the profile to identify screen colors and other environmental variables. Now, if you have bad eyes and it's really hard for you to read the screen, what you might want to do is you might want to select black extra large, reverse black extra large, because that way it makes the screen much easier to read, particularly if you have a difficult time reading the screen. In fact, some people have to have the screen this way so they can see it. So the profile is a file which saves environmental variables such as screen colors. Where can the profile be stored? It can be stored on the local computer, or it can be stored up on the server. By default, if you look under User Account Properties for Bob, under Profile, it doesn't specify anything. So what that means, if the user changes his screen color, they are saved to the profile, which is on the local hard disk of the workstation where the user is. And if the user always logs on to the same computer every single day, that's not a problem. But if the user then goes to another computer, those screen colors will not be available, and for some users, then they won't even be able to read the screen. So what we do is we configure it so the profile is saved up to the server hard disk. And that way, if the user goes to another computer, the user will also have access to his profile. If I go to the User Account Properties for Bob under Profile Path, I specify that profile will be saved under Server 1 under the user's folder, under the folder that corresponds to the user's username. And that's the same place where the user's home folder is. The profile is stored up on the server in the same place where the user's home folder is. That way, if the user goes to one computer and changes his screen colors, those changes are saved to the profile on the server. If the user goes to another workstation and logs on, the screen colors will follow the user. And this is called a roaming user profile. A profile which is stored up on the server instead of the workstation is called a roaming user profile because it allows the user to roam from one computer to the next and still have access to his screen colors. So both the home folder and the profile can be saved up to the server, and that way, regardless of the workstation that the user logs onto, the user will still have access to the profile, to the screen colors, as well as to the user's individual files. Another user property is group membership, and if I want to add Bob to a group, I select the Member Of tab. You can see he's already a member of the Domain Users group, but if I want to add him to the Sales group, for example, I click on the Add button, then I select the Sales group, and then I click on OK, and now Bob is a member of the Sales group. So user account properties include the user's login name, whether or not the account is locked or disabled or expired, time restrictions, the home folder, and the profile, and group membership. Let's look a little more closely at group membership. The purpose of groups is to allow us to assign permissions to a large number of users. And this leads us to NTFS permissions. NTFS permissions specify who can access what. For example, let's look at the payroll folder. You wouldn't want just anybody to be able to access payroll. Only people who are members of the accounting group should be able to access the payroll folder. So what we do is if only one person does payroll, we just give that one person permissions. But if a large number of people need to access payroll, instead of giving them permissions, one single user at a time, we add them to a group and give the group permissions. So I will right-click on the payroll folder and select Properties, and under the Security tab you can see that nobody has permissions. So what I will do is I will click on Add, and I will select the Accountants group and click on OK, and then that gives the Accountants group permissions to the payroll folder. So anybody who's a member of the Accountants group will have access to the payroll folder in groups. First you create the group, then you add users to the group, then you assign permissions to the group. Let me do a little demo of creating a group. I go under where I created the users under Active Directory, and I right-click on Users and select New, followed by Group. And then I type in the name of the group, such as Managers, and then I click on OK, and now I've created the group. And then to add users to the group, I right-click on the group, and select properties, and currently there are no members. So I click on Add, and I select the users that I want to be a member of the group, and I click on OK. And now you can see that these people are a member of this group. And then after creating the group, then you assign permissions to the group. Groups and permissions work hand in hand. We create a group, then we add users to the group, then we assign permissions to the group. The administrators group is a little bit different. If you add a user to the administrators group, then you are giving that user full power to create and delete other users. You're giving that user full power in the entire domain. So you could argue there are really two purposes of groups. One is to assign users permissions to files, such as the accountants group having access to the payroll database, or groups can also be used to assign administrative privileges. If you hire a new network engineer, then you would hire the network engineer to the administrators group, and then that person would have full power to create and delete users in the entire domain. Creating user accounts in the Linux operating system is conceptually the same. You create the user, you create the group, and you add the user to the group, and you frequently use the command line interface. And here is a command line interface to create a user, the command line to create a group, and the command line utility command to add the user to the group. So in summary, we've looked at user and group account management. We looked at creating users, we looked at user account properties, at creating groups and adding users to groups, and at assigning permissions to groups. And this concludes our section on user and group account management.